James R. McClintock and Baxter Watson were two successful machinists who decided to build a submarine. Horace L. Hunley was a wealthy lawyer and assistant customs agent who wanted in on the action. All they had to do was find a way to make it work. If you recall from our previous episode, the Confederacy, due to limited resources and an extensive blockade along their coast, began exploring the use of underwater mines to destroy enemy Union vessels. They were even able to use a semi-submersible torpedo boat to carry a mine and detonate it in the hull of the Union's largest ironclad ship, the New Ironsides. However, the torpedo boat failed to sink the Yankee ironclad. It seemed that if such an attack were going to succeed, it would have to come from a fully submersible submarine. Although the world had already seen the invention of fully submersible submarines by this point, it had yet to see a submarine equipped with the nautical and offensive capabilities to destroy an enemy vessel. Today's episode focuses on this endeavor. It is the beginning of a long, arduous, and at times fatal struggle to build a revolutionary craft that would eventually become a mainstay in world conflicts for years to come. It took 3 pioneering spirits to make this possible, and the first vessel they started this journey with was, naturally, named the Pioneer. It all started in 1861. McClintock and Watson owned a shop in New Orleans where they manufactured steam gauges, and their mechanical ingenuity was well known. But their foray into the world of submarines would pose a challenge much bigger than anything they had done before. The two machinists entered into an age-old wartime practice called privateering, which is when a government commissions privately owned vessels to capture or destroy enemy ships. The incentive for privateers was that they and their crew would have the rights to any ship or cargo captured. As an added bonus, the South offered a bounty of 20% of the total value of any vessel destroyed by a privateer. To prevent this from devolving into piracy, the Confederacy required privateers to apply for a license and closely monitored the vessels under contract. This is where fellow New Orleans native Hunley comes in. As privateers, McClintock and Watson would have to procure their own funding. It appears Hunley's initial involvement with the Pioneer was primarily as a financial backer, along with 2 other men. However, Hunley's talents extended beyond his pocketbook. Early in the war, Hunley led a mission to Cuba to purchase guns and ammunition for the Confederacy. He also possessed, quote, significant seafaring knowledge, according to author Milton F. Perry in his book Infernal Machines. The Pioneer was captained by a colleague of Hunley's named John K. Scott. Alongside Scott, 2 crew members would man the submarine. According to the letter of marque classifying the Pioneer as a privateer, the vessel was cigar-shaped, 34 feet in length, 4 feet in diameter, and armed with a magazine of powder. Also, its hull was painted black for stealth purposes. The Pioneer was powered by a screw propeller which was turned by the 2 crewmen through a crankshaft in the hull. A hand-operated water ballast tank was filled with water to submerge the vessel and emptied to surface again. When the sub was under the water, candles were the only source of light. One of the Pioneer's limitations was that it could only spend a short time underwater as it had no air reserve supply. Claims about the duration of their air supply range anywhere from a few minutes to a couple of hours. However, a bigger issue with the submarine was the magnetic compass that Scott used to navigate the craft underwater. It acted very slowly, which forced him to routinely surface the vessel to regain his bearings. McClintock and Watson were unable to find a compass that worked satisfactorily, so Scott had to get used to this bobbing-style navigation. Nonetheless, the Pioneer was approved for trials in February of 1862. During its first test, the submarine's target was a barge on Lake Pontchartrain. Scott manned the vessel and its owners watched from shore. As the Pioneer made its way toward the barge, Scott took his bearings above water and then slid the boat beneath the surface. The submarine approached its target, rammed the torpedo in its side, and blew the barge to splinters. Shortly after the Pioneer was commissioned as a privateer, Captain David G. Farragut and his Union fleet descended upon New Orleans. With the shore ablaze and the sound of cannon in the near distance, McClintock, Watson, and Hunley were left with no choice but to deliberately sink, or scuttle, their innovative new boat to prevent the Union from getting their hands on it. The Union later discovered the sunken submarine and dragged it to shore. Fleet engineer William H. Schock sent a letter to the Union's Navy Department informing them of the Confederate submarine, and included a detailed diagram of it. Oddly, this letter seems to have been largely ignored by the Union, and the revolutionary submarine was later sold for scrap metal at the end of the war. Even though the Pioneer had not sunk an enemy vessel, its owners didn't see the venture as a complete failure. Afterwards, McClintock wrote, "This boat demonstrated to us the fact that we could construct a boat that would move at will in any direction desired, and at any distance from the surface." After scuttling their submarine, McClintock, Watson, and Hundley returned to their shop, grabbed their diagrams and notes, and fled New Orleans before it surrendered to the Union. The trio started afresh in a new city, Mobile, Alabama, with hopes for a new boat. Although the name of the second submarine is unclear, some historians refer to it as the Pioneer II, while others know it as American Diver. This time, McClintock, Watson, and Hundley were hired to work directly for the Confederacy, but Hundley funded the project himself. Based on McClintock's descriptions, the submarine had very similar dimensions to its predecessor, the main difference being that it was slightly longer. It also had more streamlined ends, which made it easier to pass through water. The most ambitious improvement that McClintock and company attempted was to power the submarine with an electromagnetic engine. The science of electricity was still in its infancy at the time, and certainly no boat had yet been powered by it. Mark Reagan describes the innovation of this endeavor in his book, Submarine Warfare in the Civil War. He says, "This provides striking evidence as to how far ahead of their time these southern underwater visionaries were actually thinking and laboring. The idea of powering their new submarine with an electric motor can only be viewed as ingenious considering the era in which they were working. However, the engineers were unable to produce an electric motor powerful enough to propel their boat, and McClintock concluded that there was, quote, much time and money lost in efforts to build it. Electricity would have to wait for submarines of the future. So, McClintock, Watson, and Hundley then turned to steam engine propulsion. This was also a highly ambitious effort, because submerging would allow for no external air supply and provide no place for the smoke to go. It appears this didn't work either, because the boat was powered by a hand-crank propeller when they conducted their first sea trials with it in 1863. The Pioneer II increased its manpower from their first sub, sporting a 5-man crew with 4 men on the crank at a time. Despite this, the submarine was still very slow. Admiral Franklin Buchanan, commander of the naval forces in Mobile, claimed in a letter to Navy Secretary Stephen Mallory that the boat had a top speed of no more than 2 miles per hour. Despite Buchanan's concerns, with a Union blockade around Mobile growing ever constricting, the Confederacy planned to use the Pioneer II against the surrounding Union ships. However, the submarine never got a chance to prove the admiral wrong. While the vessel was being towed from Mobile to Fort Morgan to be used against a fleet surrounding it, the seas turned rough, and the choppy waters began to splash inside the submarine. After failed attempts to bail the water, the Pioneer began to sink. The operators of the towboat were forced to cut the tow line, sending the Pioneer II to the bottom of Mobile Bay. No lives were lost in the sinking. To recap, with countless hours and dollars spent and 2 sunken ships to show for it, one would be tempted to call McClintock, Watson, and Hundley's journey so far a failure. However, with no lives lost in the process, all that time and money could be seen as a long-term investment, quantified in valuable experience. Despite their failures to this point, our 3 protagonists were hardly finished with submarine development. In our next and final episode of the series, McClintock, Watson, and Hundley will dust themselves off in an attempt to build another submarine, the H.L. Hundley, the most famous Civil War submarine of all. Check it out, and you'll see whether their hard work so far will pay off in a successful submarine attack. You can also read about one of the Confederacy's early submarines and the thrilling story of a Northern spy's attempt to gather intelligence on the secret vessel in History by the Slice co-producer Doug Peterson's novel, The Lincoln League. You can find the book online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. We hope you enjoyed this slice of history. Until next time.